Hey team, welcome back to the show. Today I am joined by Kyle Baxter. Kyle, thank you for being here, dude.
Hey, glad to be here.
So, most listeners probably know you are my coach. What it's been like, I think 14 weeks now we've been working together. I've talked about you quite a lot on the show. I think you were saying it's been the best 14 weeks of your life so far.
Yeah,
Um, so,
couldn't
so I'm happy to
imagine.
help,
Every other client is just trash compared to you. So yeah.
especially Tristan Winters. Um, but no, really, it's been incredible. I've learned a ton from you. I feel like I've shared a lot of what I've learned on the show, but I'm excited to actually have you here. Again, the listeners will probably have a pretty good idea, but will you give us just a brief? I honestly don't love like we don't have to get into the whole backstory or anything of the story, but just give us like a 30-second breakdown. Like who are you? Give us your elevator pitch, who you are, what you're up to.
Um, Grew up in Vancouver, Canada. Lived in Europe. Now I live in Asia. Pedigree goes high performance strength and conditioning, mostly NHL players. Taught biomechanics at a college. Went to a commercial gym. Proposed to fiance. Moved overseas for physio school. Worked in the UK as a physio. Started online business because the way they did physio is trash. Left and went to Asia and traveled around Asia, and then we just didn't ever leave.
That's perfect. Okay, so basically, you're incredibly smart, dude. Go ahead.
I'm just like I've pretty much done everything in the fitness industry. So if you
You
can call
have
it
that's
industry.
on our call, on our first call, I was saying like I don't know how you have so much range. Like I feel like no matter what I'm asking you about, no matter what we're talking about, you just like have such an in-depth answer always. And like from working in a, what were you doing in the hospital when you worked there?
It was like we did rotations during school. So I worked in like so in North America, a physio really just like does like musculoskeletal things.
Hmm.
In UK, a physio is like a nurse. So
Right.
I worked on like cardiac rehab. So like I had a guy's battery pack that's connected to his heart in my hand while he ran on a treadmill. I worked on the ICU. I worked on orthopedics for like pre and post surgery. So you're basically like a nurse slash. You don't really do as much like conventional quote unquote physio stuff.
Right.
So
Which is
it's
crazy though.
yeah,
But
it's
also taught biomechanics out of college, right? Like two very, just a ton of diverse experiences to where it's really cool in our coaching. I feel like I mean, from all angles, from like functional side of things or nutrition, but like the biomechanics. Like again, I know we talked about. I feel like I've gone so deep into training and have learned just so much from you in the last couple months. Also like what we had Nick Ridpath on last week. I know you worked with Prescript for a while and are just like brilliant in that regard as well. So I'm really excited to get into this conversation and kind of just take the listeners through some application. I want to talk programming, man. Um, I love talking programming with you, so I think it would be really cool to kind of do a deep dive. I'm thinking probably more so around lower body programming for hypertrophy. Probably going to be a little bit more focused on glutes, but I want this to kind of be as broad as we can make it, but I feel like it's hard to go too deep in like a single hour. So probably a little bit more focused on glutes just since that's for our audience, that's typically one of the biggest goals. So really, I mean, I imagine we'll have a lot of biomechanics, some physio stuff, a lot of practical application. But anything else you want to add before we just kind of hop into it?
no, let's do it.
Cool. All right. So to start things off, I want to talk through the classic I can't feel blank muscle working. As this kind of ties into if we're looking at like this sequence of putting together a program or like someone's going through a training day. Okay, this kind of ties into where we're warming up. Also is going to tie into like exercise selection volume probably. So I can't feel my glutes working. Is that actually a meaningful red flag?
Yes and no. So this is something I've spoke about before, and I think it's invaluable for any coach or especially in-person PT to understand and physio to understand of like when should we feel sensation in a muscle and when we feel sensation in said muscle, physiologically what is going on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Everyone dismisses sensation in terms of like It's not needed for hypertrophy, which is technically true, but it might be depending on the exercise that we're doing. So 5 different times that we could feel some sort of sensation in or around a muscle. And if we can understand this sensation, we understand what action item to give and whether it's bad or good that the client doesn't feel things in their glutes, right? So number one, we feel things in a muscle when it goes from eccentric long to concentric short, and when there is a lot of tension in the shortened position. For example, hip thrust versus RDL. Hip thrust, a ton of tension in the shortened position. If I'm not feeling glutes, unless I'm hitting like the lower the rep range, the less sensation we will have because there's more global tension. But if my rep range is like 8 to 12 on a hip thrust and my client doesn't feel glutes, like that's a problem. Because when we're going from eccentric to concentric, there's a ton of tension in the shortened position. If someone's like, oh, I don't really feel my glutes on an RDL, it's like, okay, well, there's the tension is in the lengthened position, so it's a less sensation-based movement, right? So that'd be number one. Number two is a little bit more physio-esque of like, we feel a muscle when it's trying to change orientation, but the body doesn't like that, right? So I try to put my arm, well, let's stick with glutes. I try to hinge over in my RDL. I don't have any hip flexion, right? My glutes are tight or concentric all the time. I don't like using tight, but everyone understands what that means, right? We start to hinge. We feel glutes at like 30 degrees of hip flexion, right? If your chest was on the ground, it'd be around 90 or 100 degrees of hip flexion, right? That's not close to physiological end range. We don't have a lot of tension in the shortened. We are going into the eccentric. We shouldn't really feel tension, right? But because an eccentric muscle has no active tension, there's still tension.
Okay.
There's no like sensation. There should be no sensation in an eccentric based muscle.
Okay.
So as we go down, it's like, oh, I feel my glutes. It's like, okay, when do you feel your glutes? I feel my glutes halfway down. Or I feel my hamstrings halfway down. It's like, okay, well, we're not at end range. You probably don't actually have the range of motion there. And then you see their video. What happens as they get halfway down? They reach their end range and they start rounding their spine.
Mm-hmm.
Not bad by any means, but we need to get the range of motion somewhere. If I don't have flexion in my hip, I will get it from the next joint up, flexion in my spine.
Okay.
Why might that be bad? I don't want to train my spine muscles. I want to train my glutes. Well, I need to bend my hip.
Right.
The third time would be if we are at physiological end range, we will feel some connective tissue stretching. So muscle gets as long as it can. Then we go into connective tissue stretching because the muscle can't lengthen anymore. So at the very, very bottom, we would feel some tension, right? So it's like, oh, I feel the stretch. Oh, you feel it at end range. Perfect. That's fine, right? Depending on the exercise. For glutes, maybe I don't want to go all the way to end range because adductor is going to do a little bit more there. It's like quite nuanced, right? If I go all the way, adductor is going to do more. But maybe I stop before that to like still stay in like glute zone. Most people need muscle everywhere, so I would just tell them to go. But yeah.
Okay.
And then the last two quick ones would be between sets. If you feel a pump or feel sensation, you might not feel sensation during a set, but between sets, you're kind of like walking around, pacing, scrolling Instagram, and you're like, oh, like my glutes are like, I feel it from that set. That's a very good indication that we activated high threshold motor units. How do we get hypertrophy? Activate high threshold motor units under tension, slowing contractile velocity. So that's good. So between sets, you don't feel it during because maybe you do like I don't know, maybe you're me, you do a set of 4 on hip thrust and you don't really feel it during because it's just so heavy and it's crushing your pelvis. And you get up and walk around and you're like, oh, my glutes are frigged. Like that's probably good. And then the last time would be if we get DOMs after a session in a muscle. It's not indicative of a hypertrophic stimulus, but it is indicative that we did something in that muscle. Right. So if you want to know, like, hey, does this muscle is this muscle getting worked in the exercise? And the client's like, I kind of don't know. Just chase DOMs. Be like, hey, is it ideal? No. You're gonna do a triple drop set on hip thrust. The next day, let me know, or like pick a length, maybe pick a lengthened exercise. Do a triple drop set on that. And it's like, okay, next day, tell me where you feel it. And they're like, oh, I feel it in my low back. And it's like, okay, cool. Now we have a technique issue probably. But they're like, oh, my
Right.
glutes are frigged. It's like, okay, perfect, good. We're doing something right. Like, proceed. So
Okay.
if someone doesn't feel it or feels it in a certain place, we can troubleshoot to understand what the action item should be. Right? It's like I feel it in my glutes in a hip thrust. It's like, okay, good, awesome. It's like I feel it my glutes halfway in an RDL. It's like, ooh, intervene range of motion issue. Right? So it's
That's go ahead.
sorry for the long-winded answer, but I think it's very important.
No, that's incredible. And that's exactly what I was kind of wanting to get to. Okay, so we have short challenge movements, a hip thrust, for example. We are typically going to get more sensation there. Probably less so on an RDL, unless there are like some range of motion limitations or something of the sort. The muscle can't change orientation as the task suggests. Um, so we're not really concerned as like I will commonly hear with clients, hey, I don't like feel the target muscle necessarily in like RDL or even a split squat. It's kind of just like my whole body just kind of hurts. Whereas it doesn't sound like that's really too much of a concern in your case versus like a hip thrust.
Yeah, so in a hip thrust during, but let's take something like a split squat or like a Bulgarian, where like
Hmm.
very Bulgarian allows a split squat allows for like us to shift towards the working side, which is technically the most lengthened the glute can get.
Right.
So if I do one set of Bulgarians, I'm sore for like 5 days.
Hmm.
So if your client's doing Bulgarians and you give them like 2 sets and
Yeah.
and they're like kind of new in the program, they don't have any DOMs after, like don't feel zero DOMs. Maybe
Right.
like where we probably have an issue there. Right. So
Okay.
it's like this exercise should give a sensation at this time.
Okay. Okay. That's super helpful then. Okay, so kind of just how we're using this to guide how we're adjusting the program or how we might be cueing someone differently or changing up exercises. So what about with like I think the DOMS thing makes it a little bit easier, which it sounds like is probably going to be more specific to like our more lengthened challenge movements. Like, hey, do we feel it here? Or if not, where do we feel it? Cool. That makes kind of gives us an easy arrow, so to speak, pointing us to what we need to address. What about on like our short challenge movements? Like, what if this client is just like, hey, dude, I don't feel anything in my glutes when I'm doing a hip thrust? What are you typically looking to there first?
Usually, so if it's a closed chain exercise, closed chain being your feet are pressing into something.
Yeah.
An open chain exercise would be like a 45-degree hip extension, right?
Okay.
You're kind of just like floating in space and you have
Right.
the cat eye. I want to look first at foot pressure. So if we can't push into the inside of our foot, we can't get range of motion through the hip the way we want, which means we won't actually be able to produce force and contract muscles the way we want. Right. So
Hmm.
we have there's the cue of like push through your heels. Heels is like if you think about running, the heel is the brake,
Hmm.
right? When you hit the ground, your heel hits, that's the brake.
Right.
Hamstring contracts, quad contracts, you absorb the force, and then as you come over your foot, right, pressure comes to your midfoot. You push through your midfoot, that's the force. That's the go pedal, right? So if we can't push through the middle of our foot, we can't really get glutes as much as we want, right? First metatarsal head, which is like behind your big toe, that little bone where someone will get a bunion, and then the big toe and like the medial side of our foot, the inside, without losing the outside. So our foot should be very stable, right? It's not like I push in the inside and then like the outside of my foot comes off. I want like pinky
Right.
toe to be done well, and that could be just a cueing thing. That could be a foot stance thing of like, hey, you just have some long legs, like turn your feet out a little bit, right? Your knee has to
Okay.
follow. Okay, think about foot pressure, and it could be like we need to intervene distally at the lower limb. Like I have one guy who if you're a runner and you're listening to this and you look down at your feet, you'll probably have like hectic, super high arches, right? The super high arch person can't ever stretch their glutes because we need pronation of the foot,
Mhm.
movement of the foot, in order to get rotation of the hip to lengthen glutes,
Okay.
right? So it might be I can't feel it because the muscle's already contracted. I think that's especially in physio when we do manual muscle testing, which I think is a waste of time. It's like when the physio lays you on your side and they like put your leg up or your knee up into clamshell position or straight, and they're like, hey, resist, and they push down,
Right.
and they're like, oh, this muscle's weak. It's like, oh,
Okay.
it might not be weak. It just might not have the ability to produce force because it's in a certain orientation, right? For example, this light is on. If I go to the switch and try to flip it on, I'd be like, oh, light doesn't work, doesn't turn on.
Right.
But we can't see that the light is already on. The muscle's already on. And we're
Hmm.
trying to switch it on more. It's not going to produce that much force. But if it's off or eccentric, right, in a different orientation, it has room to go the other way.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't understand why it would just be on though. Like, why is this person's glute quote unquote on?
Okay, so physio things. The goal of a human being is to walk and find food. That is it. In order to walk and find food, we have to manage gravity, right? If we didn't have muscle contraction, we would be a sack of bones on the floor.
Okay.
So every second the human spends on the earth, we make a pattern of how we are going to manage gravity. And how we are going to manage gravity might be the brain might think glutes contracted all the time, right?
Okay.
It could think spine extended all the time. It could think I'm falling over or like round my spine.
Right.
So basically, posture is us trying to not fall over, is us trying to
Okay.
manage gravity, right?
Right.
If we get into it deep in your, we didn't like grind you super hard, but if you were to do like a super hard diet phase, your
Yeah.
posture would get worse. Why?
Right.
Because it takes energy to sit up straight. It takes
Right.
energy, like you'll start to slouch. So someone who sits for a very long time is very inactive, moves in a certain way. I see usually females when they grow, their femur grows super long, and then they start to move in a certain way. And if we don't change that, they'll move in a certain way forever. And then the female is now an adult and they come to you and they say, hey, I can't feel my glutes and they're really small. And you're like, don't worry, I know how to fix that. So, how we manage gravity will suggest muscle orientation and our ranges of motion that are available, right? So, if
Okay.
you're, so I had a client send me a picture of one of their clients. They worked with a lot of coaches, and it was like just a picture of legs. And they're like, hey, like this tibia has pointed out all these problems. But the leg was like one of the biggest legs I've ever seen. And I was like, how much does this person weigh? And it was like 110-kilo female or something.
Okay.
And I was like, the action item here is like move around and give this person like some sort of caloric deficit. It's
Okay.
like there is no physio things, there's no intervention that is going to counteract the fact that this person is so heavy and can't manage gravity, and that's how their joints need to work because they're
Hmm.
too like you can do manual therapy on this person, you can do any physio intervention, but it's going to be such an uphill battle because this person can't manage gravity because they're just too big, right? I work with bodybuilders, they're gigantic, some of them 250 pounds shredded. It's very different because they have to manage gravity, and gravity doesn't care. It's going to pull you down negative 9.81 meters per second, no matter who you are. So they have certain muscle orientation because they're just so big,
Okay.
right? It's the opposite with like a quote unquote aging person. They might just be so weak. They're
Yeah.
so weak. They've never worked out. They don't get any protein. They don't get any fluid because they're scared to get up and go to the washroom. It's like they're so weak that all their muscles contract and then they're stiff, right? They have co-contraction everywhere. and then we try to do something, it doesn't really work out. So how we manage gravity is going to dictate our muscle orientation, which is going to dictate if a muscle can change orientation the way we want, so we can put tension across it to grow glutes.
Okay. So, I mean, a lot of times in the instance you'll hear like, hey, you can't feel your glutes, you need to do these activation drills. It doesn't sound like your glutes not activating is actually the issue here. If anything, they're
So
too activated.
yeah, so we need to understand like, okay, what orientation is the light switch on or is it off?
Right.
Right? Some people like if you some not really in glutes. Glutes is usually like they're on all the time, right? You have a
Okay.
flat booty because you're squeezing your glutes all the time.
Okay.
Some people, depending on the muscle, it could be the other way around of like it's stuck lengthened, if you will, and we need to get it shortened. For example, people have upper back stiffness from sitting all the time, and
Right.
they'll use a lacrosse ball and like rub their upper back, and it doesn't really do anything, right? Like we're feeling sensation because the upper back musculature is lengthened all the time, right? Sternum is down. We're like this. Just because of the rib cage position, that musculature is lengthened, we get feedback and we say, I need to intervene. But the intervention needs to be the opposite because we need to understand which orientation the muscle's in. But with glutes, 99% of the time, your glutes are already squeezed. Don't
Okay.
squeeze your glutes. That's a terrible cue. Push your foot into the ground.
Okay. Now, when we're talking foot pressure, to bring it back to that, you mentioned the importance of pronating. Now, another super common thing I will see and like work through with clients is like, hey, when we're doing a hip thrust, even like a squat or a lunge where our intention is more glutes, is the heel coming off the ground, we're coming up on our toes. If we're like if we're doing a hip thrust where like really heels are coming off, we're just pushing through our toes. Is that an issue when it comes to foot pressure
I don't ever
for
want to
glute?
lose the heel.
Okay.
So we should have pressure on, I say, like 5 places. So, like both sides of the heel, both sides of the forefoot, so like right behind the big toe and right behind the pinky toe, and then the
Mm-hmm.
big toe. So like 5 places, right? Like we don't
Okay.
want to be on one side of our heel, we don't want to be on the other because then we're like moving at the subtalar joint, the joint underneath the ankle joint a little bit too much.
Okay.
Or a foot that's excessively pronated or collapsed would have like one side there. So we kind of want to have like the stable base, right? So
Okay.
if I'm more stable, I can produce more force.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Yeah. No, that
Um,
makes complete sense.
so it wouldn't say it's like if it happens on like the last couple reps, like we're trying to grind reps and like heels move, like all right, cool, like that's fine. But if we're doing like a set of 10 and happens on like 5 of the reps, it's like oh, like long term, it might not be terrible for hypertrophy, but there is hypertrophy is the long game,
Mm-hmm.
right? So say that I do a hip thrust like that forever. Eventually, we might teach the body to work in a different range of motion and not actually move through the hip joint the way we want, just move through the hip joint. And you'll still kind of feel it, but eventually your active range of motion will get lower and lower and lower and lower and lower until eventually you are the person who can't feel their glutes at all because they're just contracted all the time. Right.
Right.
So working out within our active range with certain cues will increase our active range, but working out in a certain way with not good cues will decrease our active range. This is why like so many meatheads pay me for physio because they just chase load all the time on the bar and they work out with terrible technique longer and longer and longer. They keep increasing weight on the bar, and then eventually there's no range of motion left in whatever joint. There's no range of motion, and you put tension across it. There's too much pressure, and they get some pain, and then we have to undo that. Usually, it's pretty
Okay.
easy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. So, like for the example of the glutes and that person whose glutes are always on, we have a very short range of motion in our RDL. The best, or one of the best ways to improve that, it sounds like, or over time improve that would be to focus on getting better at our RDL and not just, well, I'm going to do a shorter range of motion RDL or I'm not going to do RDLs anymore. Correct?
Yeah. So I think two things there. So we can intervene if we look at this. Is you wanted a programming talk. if we look at the program as a whole, we have a lot of pieces of this program.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I use exercise order to do if someone doesn't have access to full range of motion everywhere is the exercise before that exercise will open up more range of motion.
Okay.
Right? For example, if we can't open up the hips, I might give someone an adductor machine. Right? If I squeeze my adductors, my glutes relax. So I get a little bit of relaxation in the posterior hip when I do an adductor machine. Perfect. Then I might do some sort of single leg hip thrust in maybe a higher rep range. So higher rep ranges, we're more likely to get a change in range of motion because there's less global tension. So I go single leg hip thrust in a higher range of motion. Then I give them a leg press where we're very stable. We can focus on foot pressure. We're going to get that change in range of motion because there's like basically no gravity because I'm sitting in a chair. Then I stand them up and I'm like, okay, RDL, would I do leg press after RDL? RDL after leg press, probably in a different session, but for this example, we'll stick with this, right? Now we've gone from no range of motion and we've slowly gave this person range of motion.
Okay.
And now when they do their RDL, it looks better.
Okay.
Maybe I give them a warm-up set of a cable RDL.
Right.
Right? Cable RDL, is it a good exercise? Probably not, because the cable's pulling you forward.
Right.
But the cable's pulling you forward, which means we have to shift our center of mass back. As we shift our center of mass back, the glutes have to relax.
Okay.
So it's like, hey, before you hit dumbbell RDL, you're going to hit 2 sets of cable RDL, focusing on your foot pressure. Right? That cable pushes you forward. You have to shift back. The glutes have to relax. So now we've given more range of motion just via exercise selection and order. Like the exercises are the exact same as anyone else would program, just like the order and the cues and the thought process is more deep. We give you 2 sets of a variation of the exercise. Then we say, hey, pick up these dumbbells. And you're like, oh my God, it feels so good.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like an adductor squeeze, like hopping on an adductor machine before like an RDL, a movement where we really need to access that length and range more for the glutes would be helpful. Um, and then you mentioned like the hip thrust, leg press sequence. I know you program like a lot of heel elevated movements as well. Like for glutes, is there a lot of application there? Like I do like a squat on a heel elevated squat going into my session, for example.
For glutes, I would say not as much.
Hmm.
Um, it's more of a heel elevation will do the same thing that the cable RDL will do. So basically, if someone's center of mass is too far forward, basically you're falling on your face. If you're falling on your face, all your muscles will contract. You have no range of motion. So if I get you to be more balanced, you will immediately have a change in range of motion.
Right.
So if you're falling forward and I push you forward just a little bit more, you have 2 options. Fall on your face, body doesn't like to do that, or shift your center of mass back to compensate, in which you'll find a balanced position. Cable RDL pulls you forward, a heel elevation pushes you forward. So you have to compensate to shift your center of mass back. Now you
Right.
are on these ramps. Your center of mass is balanced over your midfoot. You automatically have more range of motion,
Right.
right? Because range of motion is dictated by the nervous system. Nervous system
Okay.
thinks you're falling over, you'll have no range of motion. Nervous system thinks you're not, chilling. That's why like a goblet squat is easier to stay upright than a back squat.
Right.
Because the goblet squat counterbalances you and your body thinks you're not falling over and you get a lot of range of motion. With glute training, I want to usually push through my entire foot and hinge over a little bit more, so make a larger lever on the glutes. When we're talking about loading up a movement, I wouldn't usually use a ramp. I would usually just give someone flat floor or
Oh yeah, I was meaning here in like the context of
yeah.
priming for the session rather than this. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So like a heels elevated exercise, very good for priming of the session. If I want to get quads, I might elevate the heel because it makes a larger lever. I can stay upright. With glutes, when we're doing an actual working set for hypertrophy purposes. I usually don't want any heel elevation, but the heel elevation is just a modulation of center of mass to get more range of motion. Then once we have the range of motion, we use it, and then we don't lose it as fast once we use it. That's usually the issue with quote unquote physio things. You go to the physical therapist, you pay your monies, they poke some needles in you, they rub you down, they give you a hot towel, and then you leave. And you feel great, you have range of motion, have some new range of motion, but you never use it, and then it just goes back to the way it is, and then you have to go pay the physical therapist again, and they make a lot of money living what I think is a boring life, and you don't get results because you never actually use the range of motion. So if we give you something that changes the range of motion and then use it after, eventually you don't have to do quote unquote boring stuff. Right? You don't have to lay on the foam roller forever. You don't have to warm up. Just like, do you know who's busy? Probably all your clients. Do they want to spend 15 minutes making their glutes in a position to do hip thrust? No. They want to walk in the gym and load the hip thrust bar and start doing hip thrust right away. And like, I think that is one of the most valuable things, because the only real finite resource is time. And if you can save someone time, you are way more valuable than anyone who can do some crazy physio things.
I love it. All right, let's get into then exercise selection and execution. One big thing I wanted to talk about is the training at long muscle lengths thing. This like focusing on hitting the longest muscle lengths possible, the like lying on the flat bench doing the bicep curl, really focusing on the stretch. It's super popular on social media right now. And this is something that I've learned a lot about and changed my mind on a lot, honestly, just in our conversations. Do you think focusing on length and bias movements is always the best route for hypertrophy?
Not always. And with some muscles, we are leaving gains on the table if we're not. And lengthened bias movements is a spectrum. So we need to be able to load a muscle the most. So the more, and we only have so much physiological range at a joint. I'll use the bicep curl example because it's a very easy one to picture. You only really have like 20 or 30 degrees of true shoulder extension, meaning the arm bone will move back in the socket without the scapula tipping over.
Right.
As soon as the scapula tips over, it is a less stable position. You will feel more sensation in your bicep, but it automatically becomes less loadable.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you go look at someone laying on a bench doing bicep curls. How much load are they using? 15 pounds? Do you know who can bicep curl 15 pounds? Probably every single one of your clients.
Right.
Right? It's like you want to make a position that is more stable. And certain muscles don't respond to stretch. So there's basically like two quote unquote types of hypertrophy. So like a muscle will grow in length in sequence. So more sarcomeres in length. Sarcomeres like the little, if you look at like the picture of the muscle, it's like the little contractile unit. So if I have a longer cord and the two sides are fixed like they always are, that string or cord will kind of like start to bulge up, and then you have a more bulging muscle. Right? Or they can grow in size in terms of like, let's say girth. That's normal, quote unquote, normal hypertrophy. So only certain amount of muscles can grow in length, and only certain muscles can grow in length for a certain amount of time. So if you already kind of like maxed it out, there's not any more benefit to that. So when it comes to glutes are one of the muscles that benefit from training in quote unquote a stretch position.
Okay.
I would always want a stretch position glute exercise in probably at least once a week. Probably if you're want glutes, you're probably training them 2 times a week. 3 gets kind of sticky with programming, but 2 times a week is the best frequency in my opinion. Because you're not just doing like 1 or 2 or 4 sets per workout. You can actually like feel like you work the muscle.
Right.
So yeah, so I would understand we only have so much physiological range, so we don't want to chase, we don't want to sacrifice load for length when the length is not actually coming at that specific tissue. Certain muscles respond to length, certain muscles do not. For example, your biceps doesn't really respond to length. So there's not really like a quote unquote lengthened bicep exercise. I want to train at different shoulder positions, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
But the stretch doesn't make muscle, tension makes muscle. So if
Okay.
I'm putting my arm behind my body to curl 15s when I could have put my arm beside my body curling 30s, like I'm doing myself a disservice.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I know previously when we chatted, you said like we're basically focusing on where does the muscle have the best leverage? That's where we can create the most tension. Would you say that's still kind of summary of your thoughts on it?
Yeah. So in terms of it, this is where theory and practice kind of like fall apart. So we will read research, and if you're a person on the internet, usually you will recite research saying this muscle has the best leverage in this position to do this task. For example, glutes have the best leverage in the shortened position to do hip extension. So, like the lockout of a hip thrust is where you're going to get the most glute.
Right.
That's a bad example because it doesn't really change, but some muscles, depending on your muscularity, depending on your setup, depending on your lever lengths, will change which muscles will do the job in a certain range of motion, which might not match up with what quote unquote research says. And I think that's where the research and the biomechanics fall short. They don't connect because people know they don't understand as much. Of so each range of motion, each task, your brain is smart. It will pick the best muscle to do the job,
Right.
right? So the glutes do a very good job at extending the hip when we're in a little bit more of a shortened position,
Okay.
right? So I can, if I load that position, I'm going to get more glutes,
Okay.
right? Or I know I'm going to get glutes the most. So like that's why a hip thrust would be such an effective exercise.
Right.
Uh, but I don't want to. I would never discount taking a muscle, training a muscle through the entire physiological range,
Right.
because it's never like I think we talk about it when people talk about this concept. It's like when glutes are on, the other muscles are off. It's like no, no, no. Like they still do something. So we were to
Right.
look at like hip flexion with a bent knee. If we're in deep hip flexion in the bottom of RDL, your adductor is probably going to do a lot of the work more than glute. Glute is still going to do work. And then as we approach full hip extension, which would be like standing up straight, your glute is going to do more and more and more work.
Right.
So in an RDL, we have a lot of tension at the bottom. We have not as much tension at the top. Is it going to be? It's going to be maybe a little bit more adductor than it is glute.
Okay.
Will that make a massive difference? No, because you probably need some adductors to fill in that spot anyways, so you look the way you want to look. But if we think about like this only really matters in with muscles that only get trained when we have like kind of an imbalance, if you will. With glutes, it doesn't really matter as much, but we want to choose exercises where at least one exercise where the strength or the resistance profile of the exercise kind of matches the where the muscle gets the strongest, where the
Okay.
muscle has leverage. So we want to pick a hip thrust at
Right.
least in the program or a 45-degree hip extension.
Okay. So it doesn't sound like this necessarily has a huge impact on how you program outside of because it doesn't sound like you actively like try to avoid lengthened positions for anything. I've noticed like in our in our programming, for example, well, I guess I still do like the prime row that is a little bit more lengthened bias sometimes, but like on a lot of lower pulling movements, like rows or pull downs, you don't like go out of your way to have me like try to like do lengthened partials or something of the sort. But I did also, we don't really seem like there's anywhere where we try to like avoid it either. It's just pretty balanced.
I try to avoid, quote unquote, avoid it with the amount of sets I will put in certain things. So we
Word.
like to use set per week as a proxy of um, some sort of stimulus, right? And there's recovery capacity and stimulus. And I'll give an example of myself. So um, I'm having like some knee niggles. So on my leg day, I would do 4 sets of quad extension.
Mhm.
Very shortened position, not that much like fatigue ability, still some okay stimulus. Then my knees felt better, and I did a hip press, but I loaded it all in the shortened position, so I did 2 and 2. And then next yesterday, I did 2 quad extension, 1 hip press, and 1 hack squat. Hack squat loaded very lengthened, right? Like those exercises, those different sessions are very, very different in terms of recovery capacity. And we need to think about like how many days in between that how many days in between do we have and can we recover? Because the lengthened position is we takes longer to recover. So if I was to give you, and I think this is why when the lengthened movement happened, physiques got worse, in my opinion, because we didn't account for this. So if I was like a normal person, I would program 2 quad extension, 2 hack squat.
Right.
Then I learned someone on the internet says quad extension is the worst exercise because it's only the shortened position, and I need to do all lengthened position. So now I do 4 hack squat. No one can recover from 4 hack squat sets. No one needs 4 hack squat sets ever. Right? So it's like now you're doing these sets and you're like, I'm killing it, lengthen stuff. But now you have the same amount, you haven't changed your split, you haven't changed the amount of rest in between sessions. So now you actually can't recover for your next leg session. And then progress goes a lot slower. So that's where I think about it like, okay, what is the recovery capacity of this person? We never really know. We take a guess and then we look at numbers and then we can maybe add some sets or take some sets away. And then we're like, okay, if I give them all legs in positions, they're probably not going to be able to recover. They're going to be frigged, right? If I
Right.
give them shortened positions, we might leave a little bit of gains on the table. Right? So that's what I think about when I think about shortened and lengthened. Of like, lengthened might be better for certain muscles, like a chest press. The chest works best in a lengthened position until your elbow is like a little bit past your body. So, like, if I was to pick an exercise to do a lengthened partial, it would be chest.
Right.
But also understand the chest fatigues quite quickly, and we can't recover as much if we just do all lengthened thing. So, like, enter chest fly,
Right.
right? And we don't load. Maybe we don't load if we have a prime machine, we can change the resistance profile. Maybe we don't load the complete lengthen, we load like the mid range.
Okay.
Right? So that's where I would think like if we're just like doing lengthen stuff all the time, we're not going to be able to recover, which means we're not going to be able to progress, which means we're not going to grow as efficiently.
Okay. Okay. So, like, let's say glutes. We have the best leverage in the short position. Do you think we can like say I'm kind of getting off track here. This is more just personal. Like do you think we could say like the short position movement like per set this is quote unquote better than the lengthened or is it just from a recovery perspective we can do more of this, we can like be more specific with the stimulus? Does that
It's
question make
better.
sense?
Okay, so it's
Like if
better
we're going to choose one, we're going to do the short versus the lengthened, for example.
if we need glutes for sure, just glutes, right? So if I do a shortened position, I'm going to get mostly glutes
Yeah.
and the other muscles are going to work less,
Right.
right? If I do something like a 45-degree leg press, it's kind of like hard the whole time. So I'm gonna get glutes and adductors and quads.
Yeah.
So that's where it comes into like we can only do so many sets because time and recoverability. It's like, okay, maybe we don't, maybe this person only has a certain amount of time. We give them a leg press because they want their entire leg to grow. Right? As long as they're progressing, it doesn't really the exercise select as long as you're progressing and your execution is good, the exercise selection nuances matter a little bit less.
Yeah.
So I would choose if we had to pick one, it would be like, okay, do you want to just grow glutes and grow nothing else? Okay, maybe hip thrust is your play, right?
Hmm.
But if we want to, I can only pick one, but we want to grow a lot of things. It's okay, cool. Like I'm a hip thrust is it's less. I guess it's. I don't want to say it's less tension, but it's less global tension than something like a leg press.
Yeah. It's a lot more
But
specific.
yeah, we can load up a leg press a lot more. So it's like we'll get. I think we kind of when I started training, we didn't ever talk about lats or upper back. We just talked about back.
Right.
Right? It's not like how many sets of lats do you do? It's like how many sets of back. Right? How many sets of legs do you do? Maybe you split it
Right.
into hamstring and quad. But it's not like we're not having conversations about like leverages and stuff of like this is a leg exercise. It's a leg press. It's not a glute press. It's not a quad press. It's a leg press. So it's like if we want legs, maybe we give someone leg press and they get all of the leg. So that's kind of like one is not better than the other. We need to understand. So for example, my fiance, we split up glutes is one session, and then 2 days, and then 48 hours later, she trains quads and hams.
Right.
So in the glute session, I'm trying to get the least crossover into quads and hams possible.
Right.
So because I need to train those. And then in the other session, I'm trying to get the least crossover into glutes. Right. So she doesn't have just like a quote unquote leg press. She'll have like very specific cues to bias muscles because she wants to train 5 days a week. And there's only so many muscles to train when you don't train chest or arms or back that much.
Okay.
So,
That's kind of the point I was trying to get at, though, is I think that a lot of times when people talk about this, it's okay if this is like short, the glutes have best leverage in the short position, then all this long muscle length shit is just trash and not effective, or vice versa. When again, it's kind of like, just how does this work in the context of our program and the person in front of us's goals, rather than like, this is necessarily a lot worse than this. To completely change subjects here, bringing it back to glute training, how important do you think unilateral work is when it comes to glute training? Like, is that going to be a big priority for you?
um, yes, not in the narrow focus of glute training, but in the focus of having a human actually function like a human. So every time we walk, one side of our pelvis has to go one way, one side of our pelvis has to go the other way. If you don't understand how that looks, go on your iPhone and click the little red shirt walking emoji guy, and you'll see one of his legs is in extension and one of his legs is in flexion. That is basically human movement. And we don't really emulate that in the gym ever. The only exercise that gets your leg into true extension is a split squat. One of the only exercises that gets you into an ipsilateral hip shift. Ipsilateral means towards the working side. So if I was to stand on my one leg, right? If I had both my legs on the ground and I take one leg off the ground, if I don't shift my weight over the working leg, I fall over. So the ipsilateral hip shift and the true hip extension in a split squat is invaluable when we talk about function long term. So I would always include at least one, I'd not even say unilateral, like split squat variation in someone's program.
Okay.
And I think it's just a cheat code of like hypertrophy is a long game. If you don't
Right.
use it, you lose it. You never go into hip
Okay.
extension. You means you never go into as much true hip flexion on one side, which means we're going to maybe have a detriment of range of motion eventually. So, do I think that it is the split squat is the hardest movement in my opinion, which means and it's the least stable, which from a pure hypertrophy lens makes it a little bit worse of a movement, right? People have knee pain in the backside because they don't have hip range of motion. They are wobbling everywhere. It's like, do I hold the dumbbell here or here? Like it's more complicated than like a leg press. Sit there, push. So I think from a pure hypertrophy perspective, the exercises might be quote unquote worse. But in the long game, if you can control your body enough to produce force on one leg unsupported, when you are going to produce force in a gigantic chair pushing with both of your feet, it's so easy. Right? So you can do, it's always a litmus test of function for me of like, can you do this is for a male usually because females don't train push muscles as much. Can you do an incline chest press with the same weight that you can do a Bulgarian split squat with? That's my test of function. But it should be pretty close.
Okay.
So if you can press 70s per hand, you better be able to do a Bulgarian with 70s per hand.
Okay.
Because it shows like your upper and lower body function of like incline dumbbell press needs quite a bit of shoulder function. It's not quite unstable. Lower body, when I say function, I mean like joint range of motion, coordination, all of the things kind of in one.
Yeah.
It also makes you, I think, when the narrow-minded hypertrophy, I don't want to say narrow-minded, the narrow lens hypertrophy crowd, it just makes you more versatile in terms of like being able to train in different places. Right? So if you do all these machines all the time, everything's stable, and you go like to a hotel gym and they just have dumbbells, it's like you're just all over the place because you've never practiced.
Right.
Right? But it's like if you do Bulgarians and dumbbell chest press, and then you go to sit on the prime chest press machine, you're like, this is so easy. Like I can crush dumbbells, and now the handle's not going everywhere. So I think that's one of the things where a split squat pattern will always be in every single one of my programs for myself and my clients. It's kind of a non-negotiable just because of the function element of it. And if you're a coach listening or a person who works out, just do a split squat pattern at least once a week. If you have 2 leg days a week, do one both leg days, and you will have way less leg issues and low back issues because your pelvis will work the way it should.
I have a client I'm working through this with right now where I have her doing split squats and she's just been hating it. But we come from like hey, when we started, like we couldn't even do like a leg press without pain. We couldn't do an RDL without pain. And we worked through that. But now it's kind of like us working down this chain of, okay, like slowly correcting these things. And it's, I know for her, a frustrating thing because it's like, well, it's just my stability is the limiting factor right now. I suck at this, which again is, hey, probably a big part of why we need to improve at this and get better at it. So that's helpful to hear as well. How much time do you need to hop off here? I know we're already at an hour. Okay, you got a few more.
I sit on a computer and so I'm going to move this computer over to a screen and sit there. So this
You're
is
the
probably
man.
more
Okay.
fun.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Okay, let's run through a few more. I won't keep it too much longer, but I want to talk a little bit on exercise execution as well. And just a few common mistakes I think people make with their glute training. So a very common one, hopefully you think this is a mistake as well, is the high and wide leg press. High and wide leg press, we're gonna get more glutes. What's your take on that?
High and wide leg press, we're going to get more. We're going to get less range of motion.
Mm-hmm.
And the farther out we abduct our feet, the wider we go. The more space we make at the pelvis and hip joint to get range of motion. I'm going to play both sides here. So, pros, high and wide leg press. We have someone with terrible range of motion. We can't put our feet together because we won't have hip range of motion. We move your feet wider, and now you'll have hip range of motion, and you'll be able to not move your pelvis as much. So we can actually get glute. If you can't picture this, put your feet right beside each other. Try to do a squat. It feels terrible because you need a ton of range of motion. right? Put your feet wider, do a squat, feels better. As well as we will get, because the glutes have a different, kind of like a different origin and a different insertion point. So it's not like the bicep. It's like inserts in the shoulder, inserts in the forearm, right? The
Right.
glutes have like such a wide insertion point. Doing a wider stance may get more upper glute, and it will likely limit range of motion.
Okay.
So that is probably bad, right? And we don't get as much of a stretch, which might be bad.
Okay.
So it depends on the person's capacity. I'm not going to be like, this is more glutes. That's definitely incorrect. But from the person, I might put them a little higher and wider if they have questionable range of motion, so we can get full foot pressure, so we can move through the hip from a ability to function perspective, high-ish and wide-ish, not like I'm at the corners, might be a little bit better, right? But
Okay.
I think if we're gonna go down this of like, we would feel that quite a lot high and wide in the adductors.
Hmm.
Where does the adductor magnus connect? To the ischial tuberosity, which is quote unquote the glute ham tie-in. So people are like, oh, I'm working my tie-in, which is like, kind of, but your adductor is just extending your hip, but you probably don't have the range of motion, so you're actually feeling it in the tie-in quite a bit, in not a good way. And people think they're working the tie-in, so I think that's why it comes from like the competitive people wanting to get super lean and have like the tie-in. But it's like you're
Right.
not working your glute, you're just working your adductor that connects under the tie-in.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I think where that came from, of like, I feel it more, therefore it must be working more. And it's like, well, probably not.
Okay. So someone who moves relatively well, we don't have issues at like the hip joint then. Would you opt for that? Or would you opt for like, hey, if we're gonna be on a leg press, I want a narrower stance. Like no, just a normal, decent quality range of motion.
Yeah. So two options for leg press for me. Do we want to just use glutes, narrow stance? Do we want to use muscles? Pick the stance you can move the most load. You move the most load, give the most tension across the most muscle. More bang for your buck. If someone's like new to training, they have no muscle anywhere. I need as much muscle as I can. Trust me,
Yeah.
lady. Your quads aren't too big. We're just not that lean. Like, we just need to press the most load. So I don't want to bias anything, because there's nothing to bias. It's just a blank sheet. Just a blank sheet of paper, right? So I want
Okay.
the most, and then we can see like, oh, okay, cool. Like, now we can sculpt a physique with certain places. So I'm either biasing glutes for a certain reason, but with most people, it's like, hey, just find a comfortable position and increase load until there's no plates left.
That's normally what I like the glute focused leg press specifically isn't really one I ever program. I normally default to the just where is the person, which I normally will cue it as almost like a quad bias leg press, just because typically it'll be the person has the most range of motion there. But I very much in agreement on that front. Okay, so like let's say like a squat or a deadlift pattern, like a sumo squat, a sumo deadlift. Then is that something aside from like range of motion limitations? Is that something that you would really use in this instance, like
Um,
for glutes?
Probably, I wouldn't really use. For me, a squat pattern is squats.
Yeah.
Like, I don't remember the last time I programmed like a glute focus squat,
Hmm.
where like you would take a smidge wider of a stance and you would allow the pelvis to travel backwards and the torso to travel down towards the floor. So you're kind of like looking at the floor, making the longest lever on the glutes possible.
Right.
Because just if you were to take a snapshot from the side of that and an RDL, it's the same. But it's just we're loading the spine in a position that it's just a harder movement. So
Right.
for squats, a squat for me is always either an everything movement or a quad movement.
Okay.
It's not really a glute movement.
Okay.
So a wider stance. If you were to do a quad focus or a glute focus squat, you would need to take a wider stance than a quad focus squat. And there's a spectrum of like too wide just limits things. Right? Like
Hmm.
wider, not wide. Wider than
Yeah.
quads, but not like wide. Because then you lose your foot pressure in your frame.
Right.
Right?
Okay.
Look at every person's sumo deadlift. If they brought it in just a little bit and had a little bit more movement through their hips, they would sacrifice range of motion, meaning they would have to move the bar farther, but they would use more muscles and it'd be better long term.
Okay.
Shout out all the powerlifters who pay my bills because they can't figure that out.
Shout out. Okay. That makes complete sense. So let's talk about RDL. I imagine an RDL is a movement you are a fan of for glutes.
Yes.
Okay. So we talked through this a bit earlier, but we talked on kind of the like, hey, your glutes are too active. Basically, they're already contracted or whatever. Um, and that was one of the issues with like, hey, I feel like an RDL in my back, right? We went out of range of motion of the glutes, start using our spine. When you see like, I imagine this is extremely common for you as well. A client starts with you, hey, I just feel RDLs in my back, not my butt or my hamstrings. Aside from like the whole conversation around sensation, basically the back pain is an issue. What are you typically seeing as the most common culprit of that?
You are off balance. So basically, in order to get range of motion through your hips in an RDL, we need to be balanced. Meaning, biggest things I see, knee will travel. We would cue hips back on an RDL, correct?
Typically,
Problem
yeah.
problem with hips, like relative to a squat, we'd cue hips down, right?
Right, right.
So you cue hips back on an RDL. As you push your hips back, problems arise if something doesn't go forward. And the thing that needs to go forward is your torso so
Mm.
that we stay balanced over the midfoot.
Yeah,
Because if we're not balanced over the midfoot, we will immediately have less range of motion because we are falling over. So as soon as your weight goes to exclusively your heels and you lose your forefoot, you will see a lot of people do this online. Maybe their toes even come off the ground. They're not getting true range of motion through their hips. You look at their
right.
glutes, they're not that big. Do you know why? Because you can't move through your hip if you're off balance. So people are scared to let their torso go towards the ground because, like, oh, my back. But it's
Mhm.
actually better because we are getting true range of motion and we won't actually move through the spine as much. Not
Right.
that moving through the spine is bad, but it is bad if I want to train glutes because I need to move through the hip. So the best cue I could ever give anyone is in an RDL, if you were to drop the weight, you should not fall over. And I've told clients in person to do this. They're like, I'm balanced. I was like, no, you're not. I was like, try this. Because you're gonna have to do this on your own. Drop the weight when you're at the bottom. And they drop the weight and they stumble backwards. I know they're gonna stumble, so like I'm behind them to catch them. And they stumble backwards and they're like, oh, okay. And I was like, okay, do another one. And I pause at the bottom. We do like a light-ish weight. And I'm like, drop the weight. And they drop the weight and they don't move. I'm like, that's what you need. That's the simplest way to cue an RDL of like, if you were to drop this weight, would you fall, yes or no? Is this weight holding you up? If the weight is
Right.
holding you up, you are off balance, you're falling. And that's the biggest thing I see with RDLs. And it can be fixed very, very simply, usually by just them understanding that like their chest towards the ground, chest facing the ground is not a bad thing. And them feeling foot pressure. It's just like if you never thought about it, it's hard. And then once you get it, it's like, oh, it's so easy. So
Yeah. I see like every single person who starts is doing that. It's almost always toes are coming off of the floor. That for me, I feel like is one of the easiest things to focus on is just toe contact with the floor. Be okay with like you don't have to keep pushing your knees back and back and potentially even like a little bit of a positive shin angle. Um, What about a hip extension, like a 45-degree hip extension? I find that's another one people struggle with quite a lot. It's just not as intuitive to get the most or to set up and execute as like a hip thrust. I don't know if it's potentially just because it's so easy to underload. How do you typically like cue people to get the most out of that?
I think the biggest thing with the hip extensions is we just have the pad way too high all the time.
Oh yeah.
I see it
Yeah.
every single like every single client who's like hip extension feels terrible. And I like they put in their check-in and like send me a video. And I'm thinking to myself, the pad is too high. And they send me a video, and the pad is too high. Because when you get into the hip extension and the pad might not feel too high, but then as you hinge, the pad might be too high and it will limit hip range of motion. And then we will round through our spine and then it won't feel good. Another thing that will be very hard to move through the pelvis of as soon as the knee is locked out, we have no range of motion through the hip.
Okay.
So depending on the hip extension that you have, we always want to, it'll be easier or harder to keep a soft knee. So putting something between the pad and the thigh is something that I use just to keep a little bit of a knee bend.
Oh, that's cool.
So that like people can move through their hips. Because as soon as you lock out your elbow, you have no range of motion through your shoulder. As soon as you lock out your knee, you have no range of motion through your hip because you can't rotate your feet.
Okay.
Right. So those are the two things that can fix a hip extension very, very, very easy. Of like your pad is too high and it's literally just blocking you from going down.
Yeah.
And then your knee is too locked. So you like push my knee into the pad and that unlocks my knee. And I'll feel a ton of hamstring right away. Depending on which exercise, where I'm trying to load. But yeah, as soon as you can move, you're just putting yourself in a position. It's usually a setup issue that you just can't move through the hips. If the pad's too high, it's blocking. If your knee's locked, you can't move through. So those two things will fix it quite quickly for most people.
So you could put like one of the blue Air X pads, for example, like on a hip thrust, or excuse me, a hip extension.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you put it like on the thighs, and then you have a little bit more of a bent knee.
Okay, that's super interesting. I did not know. That's helpful though. And then as far as the pad height, I typically tell people like about 2 inches below the crease in the hips where your hips will fold. What are you typically telling people there?
Even more. So like if you put your hand on your hip bone, you're in the front, ASIS, I put like a hand length down.
Okay.
Unless you have like a big stomach, you'll be fine.
Okay. Perfect.
So that's where when you're at the top. It's gonna feel like, oh, this is like super far down my thigh relative to like, but it has to be there to make sure that as your hip hinges, you don't run into the pad.
Okay. Okay. Super helpful. Dude, this has been a great episode. I feel like there's so much takeaway in this. Honestly, we only got through like half of my outline, so I would love to have you back on at some point to talk through the other half of this. But I feel like there are so many little rabbit holes I always end up wanting to go down with you. I don't want to take up any more of your time though, and I have to pee super bad, so I'm going to wrap it up here. But before we go, we just let everyone know where they can find you and anything at all you would like to plug.
Yeah, just Instagram. Coach Baxter on Instagram. The original Coach Baxter, because I made my Instagram coach because I coached hockey. This was before online coaching was a thing. I coached little kids, and then everyone made their Instagram coach. Now I'm just one of those peasants who's just in the
just one of the plebes now, one of the sheeple.
It made my thing Coach Baxter like 12 years ago or whenever I started Instagram. But yeah, if you're having issues with pain or whatever, hit me up. If you want coaching, probably go to Jeremiah because he's probably a better guy. But if you want coaching from me, I can do that too. So.
You're an incredible coach, dude. I've learned so much from you. Had a great time as well. Again, man, thank you for being here. I will link all your stuff up in the show notes. I'll be right there. And again, we'll have to have you back on sometime. But again, dude, thanks for the time.
For sure. Enjoyed it.